Okay, I want to continue coding my Belleville Running Club website, Express server backend. And so just made a quick how to connect into a Mongo database. And now what I want to do is I want to actually list my users out of my database in this list route. And here I'm going to work on these three operations. And we'll start here of listing current users, getting a user by their ID, and then updating a user. And so to start with the list, of course, we need to hit the list route. And so I'll fire up Postman. And just a couple of things that are worth doing. I've got a debug package, so I'm going to import debug on my app user. I've already done that debug user. I'm also going to import debug on my database, and this will be app database. And so I need to write a function here. I'm not going to call my ping. You could leave that coded in or not. Async function, and we'll say get all users, and pretty interestingly enough, it fills me in here. Let's go ahead and connect to my database, which is DB different than underscore DB, right? So a local variable called DB, connect to database. Here, collection is not called users plural. In fact, if I boot this up, this should be a user collection singular. And I kind of talked about the naming conventions on collections being singular. And it is a capital U, so I'm going to capitalize that and get rid of the S. This is finding all and converting it to array. And so here we'll have an array of users and returning users. Now, I don't have any users, so why don't I just insert some dummy data to get this off of the ground? And so let's just insert a document with an object ID. And now my schema that I want to reference, I will pull up my database schema. And so these are the fields on my user. I have a username, an email, and a password. And this is just for the sake of getting users out of my database. I'll clean this data up because this is going to be trash data that I'll delete later. Username, email, and password. So we'll say username, email, and password. Clearly my most secure password ever. And that gets me every time where I have a mistake and it doesn't actually insert my document. Oh, and I think it's because I needed my comma here. There we go. Put my comma in the wrong place. There we go. So there's my first user. And we'll just add one more. base. Okay, so there's my 2 users. They have their user IDs. Let's list all users. So back in my application, let me take a look at package.json. And I do have a start script. I also have a dev script, which runs nodemon. And so let's just do an npm run dev. And so we actually get server started. It does say ping the database. I can go into here and change that console log into a debug server. No, I called it debug. I'll call this debug DB, debug database, debug database variable. Okay, so now this is much better. Okay. So you can see the color coding is really nice on our debug. So I get a console log or a debug message from my index file. Here's another color for my database file. I'll do another one from my user file. So this is now my user list route. I have a function called getAllUsers that I will export in my database module so that I can import it in my user model. So I'm going to import getAllUsers from database, and you got to put the .js on it. Get rid of that extra curly. So I have a function called getAllUsers, and that function is an async function. So I need to await the call. So here's my user list. And I am going to const users equals await getAllUsers. It's going to say it needs to be inside of an async function. So this is an anonymous arrow function. So we will say async. And here I'll say if there are users, we get to send those users back. Let's send our users back. Otherwise, res status error getting users. So server side error getting users. So we should hit a debug user when we hit our list route. We should hit our database to get all users. If we find them, then we do that. So let's go to Postman. And I'm going to bring that over. Now my BRC collection, this is running on port 5000, API user list. And there we go. We're getting our 2 database users out of the database. And next up is to get a user by ID. Got an interesting cursor there. So let's go back into our database module. Async function get user by ID. We'll pass in the ID. Connect the database, find one ID. Now the thing to note here is that ID has to be an object ID as saved as an object ID in the Mongo database. If you send in a string right here, that string won't work. And so there is an object ID function that belongs in this MongoDB driver. And so we can actually say ID equal to new object ID and wrap that here. It does say that's deprecated. And so I have seen that before, although it does work, there might be a newer syntax. Nonetheless, we can send a string ID in to the get user by ID, and let's go over to our user. We hit our user ID route. We read the ID from the params, and by the way, here's my app user. You can change the colors. I don't like how my database is yellow and my app user is also yellow. You can change the colors on that. I'm not going to focus on that right now. Debug user. I'll just say, getting user by ID. And I'm going to take this user list debug off. As soon as I'm done with the debugs, I don't keep them in there. Otherwise, you just end up with too many unnecessary logs. But while I'm testing it, I will. And let's do this. Const user equals. We got to bring that function in. So there's get user by ID. Let's export it. Get user by ID. Import it over here. Get user by ID. And let's see. Await get user by ID. Pass in the ID variable. Again, it'll be converted on the backside. We then need to await. Async, excuse me. Had that backwards. Then we get to say if the user is truthy, let's send the user back, else error getting user. Take that line out. Now we can read my user ID. This is my user ID. And hit Control C to copy that. And if I bring over Postman, I'm going to call this list all users. And so I can close my list all users. I'm going to add a request. We call get user by ID. It's going to be very similar route, API user on port 5000 / and again go copy that ID. Control C should get the job done. Okay, so that's in the params, so it's in the URL. And let's see what breaks. 65A7. And so I'm going to put that ID here. Called it user. Oh, wait a minute. Let's see. Forgot my $sign right there. So let's ping that again. Let's send that over. Getting user by ID 65A7. So far so good. And get user by ID. Find one in my user collection, DB user. Maybe I have to take the word new off of here. I don't think so. Yeah, I didn't think so. You needed the keyword new. And so I don't think my user is coming back. Debug DB user is JSON stringify user. And so I don't think that user is coming back, obviously. Error getting user. User is null. So it is giving me a hard time with that. I see it. In the database, the ID column is _ID. So we need to find the underscore ID, and that should fix our problem. So it's underscore ID. And if I go back to here, underscore ID, that's fine. Just property name underscore ID. Okay, so good. That is getting a single user by ID. And of course we can now pass in Charles Corrigan and get Charles Corrigan by ID. All right, and so the last route that we were refactoring to hit the database is update. And so we're going to allow a user to update their fields, and right now we'll allow all the fields. And so the fields are username, email, and password. And so we have to kind of go through the rec.body. We'll call this our updated user. And basically what we want to do here is loop through our updated user and determine what fields are updated, and then send that updated object into a function here. So async function update user. Let's just pass in the updated user. And so here, it makes that function pretty simple. Let's review this. Connect to the database. Here we're hitting our user collection, running an update 1, where the ID is the user's ID, and we are running a set function on that user, and then returning a database result. And so this database result, I'm going to want to inspect that. And so I'm going to do a debug DB. The DB result is stringify that result. So you'll see that makes the result object very pretty into a string JSON object out of that database. And so let's do that. Let's export update user. Let's go into here, bring in update user. Okay, now this is always a fun loop to write when you're iterating over properties. Let's write it in the right method here. So here, so all we have in this case is the updated user here. We don't have the current user. So think about the route. We probably need a route where we're sending the ID of the user to update up in the params. And so like we did in this method, let's get the ID out of the params. So we're going to have to pass that and then pass some other data in the rec.body. Once we have the ID, then let's look up the user ID. Const current user equals await get user by ID. So we're going to read our user out of the database. And let's mark that as async. Okay, so we're getting a current user object. This is the object to update. Object to update. And this is the object with new values. And so let's see what here, this is cool. So we're going to say const user. This is object destructuring. We're destructuring the current user with the updated user and creating one new object. So this variable here called user should. Now before we pass that in, I just want to test it, right? So I'm going to debug user, and I'm just going to throw that out into debug. And so let's create another route here. Add a request. Now, by the way, this is on a post. This is a post update. So let's change the method to a post. And wait a minute, no. I'm gonna change that back to a get. I don't want to change that one. I want to change this one to a post. And it's gonna look a lot like this. So we're gonna, let's see what user that is. That's Charles Corrigan. And we'll change his password. And so in the body, we can change the password field to all ones. Now this isn't saving it to the database. It says it cannot post to API user. So let's see what's going on. Okay, it actually worked. User ID is this. Okay. So it did not change his password here. Current user, spreading the updated user. So there was a password field that should be updated. Let's take a quick look at this. I'll troubleshoot and pause. Oh, well, critically, I see my problem. I'm forgetting my /update. And so I'm not even hitting that route correctly. So I need to change my route to include that variable. And so if I do API user :ID, excuse me for clicking, very similar to here, we did a get user by ID. This is a post, and we could do maybe /update /user ID. And so what is the right URL? Well, I can do that, /update /user ID. Now this is actually, you could see the new user is including his password. So let's take out these extra debugs that I no longer need. Again, you could see they get a little overwhelming if you keep them in there. So I'm going to save that. And okay. So now if I give Charles a new password, it says in the database, it's getting in my database, in my get user by ID, I left that in there, so I don't need that anymore. One more time. So this is on my update user ID. I am seeing my updating user. Here's my new password, Charles Corrigan. And if I hit it again, maybe I go here and I say username. And right now his username is it's Pascal casing. So maybe just do something like that. Make up a middle name for him. And now I see Charles Allen Corrigan. Again, this is not saving it to the database. And so we could, continue as needed, but again, that's working. And so I can get rid of my debug user. Now that I know this user object is working, I just got to send that into my method. Okay, so I do have a result object being debugged. So let's see if I const db result equals await update user. And so if now this will actually do an update on the database. So I'll throw in Charles, and if I get the user by ID, you can see his password has changed. But I'm more interested in this database results. The DB result acknowledged as true, modified count is 1. And so what I will do with that information, that this object is being stored in this variable. And so I could say if DB result dot modified count is 1, we could say user updated else error updating user. And so if I get user by ID, his passwords are all 1. Of course, we can send it back. Send that in. It says user updated. Of course, you could say, you put backticks in here and put whatever you know, user.id. You could say user ID updated successfully. So whatever kind of success message you want to give, 200 user updated successfully, get user ID, put his name back or password all 1s. Okay, I just wanted to cover those 3 routes and get those working with the database. Up next, I get to register users and log in users. And so I will continue to flush this out as we work through this.